Hi, my name is Julia Métraux. I'm an editorial fellow at the Mighty, and I'm very excited to leave a conversation today with Emma about navigating college disability services.
Hi, my name is Emma. I've been doing live streams for the Mighty for I think 5 or 6 years now, and I'm a mental health advocate here.
Great. So just to get started, I'm wondering what disability services were like at your school and what your experience has been.
Yeah, so I had disability services actually originally in high school, and then I was on a 504K plan. And then when I moved to college, I got them in college as well. So I went to Cornell University, and I ended up getting the same accommodations that I had in high school there. So for me, that was extended time and a separate testing room if I wanted. Hello, Claire.
Great.
Sorry, someone in the comments.
No, we definitely welcome any comments. Yeah, if you have any questions at all, please just leave it in the comment section. So I had a very different experience. I actually was at two different schools, one in Canada, one in the United States.
Okay.
So in Canada, they don't really have a law that's equivalent to the American with Disabilities Act. So that, of course, transforms it a lot. So I had two very different experiences. My first experience was I was undiagnosed with an autoimmune disorder. I really needed stop time just so I could take care of my physical health and also finish my exams. I unfortunately could not get it just because I didn't have any proof that I had this. So I ended up taking a break from school and then worked until I actually got a diagnosis. Then I went back to school at the new school in New York City, and I found that process to be a lot smoother. I registered for accommodations for an autoimmune disorder I have, and I also received accommodation for a hearing loss that I was born with as well. So,
yeah, that's definitely much different. I did not know that, obviously it makes sense, but that Canada's is very different. And so it sounds like it was a lot harder to even get accommodations there. I don't know if that's true or not, but even if you had been diagnosed, from what you learned, do you think it would have been harder to get accommodations?
I think it would have been harder. And things I guess I could say with my experience in Canada, I don't know it would be like in other countries as well, but it seems like a lot of laws were provincially based. So an experience that someone might have in Ontario would be very different than my experience in Quebec. And also, I was at a huge university. I think we had around 25,000 undergrads, but I might be wrong. And we only had, I think, 10 people working in the disability services office.
Wow.
So which is a problem with universities in the United States as well, with being access to care I received, but also I know people who were diagnosed and had notes that they could give and also did receive accommodations in high school. They struggled too, just because there didn't seem to be enough resources.
Yeah. I know for me, my accommodations, like again, I kept the same accommodations from when I was in high school and moved to college, but I didn't really know to go back in and, get more and change my accommodations. But for you, how, when you were going through, because you got yours originally first in college, how, when you were going through that process of getting them, how did they do that? Like now that you were diagnosed and you brought in that, did they just kind of assign you accommodations, or did you get to kind of talk with them and choose?
I talked with them. I didn't personally have a chronic illness when I was in high school, basically, but I did have friends who did. I had a very close friend who is diabetic, and I knew that she had stop time. And I'm like, okay, this is a type of disability accommodation that I know of because I had a friend who had it. So then I asked for that. I also asked for extended time. The school that I happened to go to was more essay based than it was
Okay.
the second school I went to was more essay based. So I dealt with things where also I had to ask for a lot more extensions. So on my accommodation note, it said please work with the student if she asked for extension.
That's cool. I think for me, again, I only had mine originally first in high school, but when I went to get them originally, they kind of, well, first of all, actually, they wouldn't give me accommodations at first in high school. So we kind of had to fight the school to get them. So even though I was diagnosed with dyslexia as well as anxiety disorder, they didn't want to give me accommodations because I was still a good student. So thankfully, my mom had a friend who kind of worked in the disability services in a different state, and they told her no, that's wrong. You need to make this you need to threaten to sue the school basically to try to get the accommodations. But getting them, I actually was too young to even really know what these accommodations were. So when, they assigned me originally extended time and a separate testing room, I was like, okay, I guess that's all the options there are. So when I moved to college, it was similar. They didn't really sit down with me in college and say like, okay, like you've grown, potentially your anxiety has changed. Let's look at and make sure that these are the accommodations you need. They just kind of said, here's what you had, here's what you're going to get. And I didn't really learn until later on that I should have gone back in and advocated, and I should have, talked to them and said, like, here are the things that I actually think I need. Here's what, would actually benefit me. But because I had an anxiety disorder, I was too anxious to go in and do that. So I know for me, my school didn't really check in very well with me throughout the 4 years that I was there. They basically once a year were like, come get your letters and then leave. But I have some friends who had better schools they went to. What was yours like once you actually had the accommodations?
They were pretty good. I also think one thing that helped for me is that I was open with my professors about like why I need this accommodations. I don't know whether or not I was open because I felt like I had to give evidence of like why I'm asking for this because I didn't want to seem to be lazy. I guess I don't know, that was something that was going on in my head. I felt for the most part, people were accommodating. Yeah, I would say for the most part, but it's definitely a difficult process. And before I was diagnosed at my previous school, I felt like I couldn't even get any accommodations that I actually needed.
Sounds like talking to your professors was it, I mean, you seem to have a better experience with it, but I guess, did you ever have professors that had misconceptions around it or weren't welcoming to the accommodations?
In my first school, when I was just like, hey, I'm sick, I don't know why, a lot of my professors were like, sorry. I actually had one professor who was completely understanding, and she was like, she actually wrote my letter of accommodation to go to a different school because she saw that I wasn't in the best learning environment. She was like, I completely understand. But at my second school, I say for the most part, they were accommodating. I don't know. I feel like the hardest time that I had when I really need extensions was during finals because it's like, oh my God, I have these 10, 15-page papers. I'm gonna have to pull all-nighters, which is bad for me. And I guess, which is understandable. Professors have to turn in stuff by a certain date, but also when you have so many papers due at once, it's hard for that not to take a toll on your health as well.
Yeah, for sure. And again, people, if you have questions, anyone who's watching, feel free to put them in the comments. Someone said that they learned how to advocate for themselves in college, and I'm so glad you did. Again, I feel like I learned probably too late in my time at college. And I also think, at least for me, having an anxiety disorder, one of the things that I really struggled with was social anxiety. So approaching my teachers, approaching my professors, we get the letters for accommodations, but we don't, and it doesn't, disclose what, why we're getting the accommodations. But whenever I had to go up to a professor with a letter, it was this weird moment of, okay, like everyone, who stayed behind class in the first 2 sessions are probably giving a letter for accommodations. Like, do I explain why? Do I just give it to them? And those interactions for me were always very uncomfortable. Most professors, this was a normal process. You gave them a letter, they just gave you the accommodations that were on there. That was it. Nobody else checked in with you, nothing. I had a few who would give you the kind of, when you gave it to them, as if it was really taxing for, you to have these accommodations. And it, at that time for me, it's like, okay, you just think this is fake. You think this is an excuse. And that, made me feel guilty for having the accommodations. But then I also felt almost better because one of my accommodations was to take a test in a separate room. And because I didn't have the best impression of that professor, I didn't want to be taking an exam in the room with them. And so if I was taking a separate room, I didn't have to be kind of around them. But yeah, I think most of my professors just didn't really say anything. I wish I had kind of been able to speak with them more. And as you said, talk with them about extensions. I always just was so anxious about doing any of that I never went to them for more unless I was really, really at a low point. And when I did have a couple of those, I had some where, I went to a teacher and I really needed something. And I had one professor who dropped everything. I basically walked into his classroom and I was like, I don't think I can come to class today. This is a really small group class. It was like, you had 7 people in a lab class. And he was like, all right, do you want to go on a walk with me? And I was just kind of like, my mind was all over the place. I was like, sure. And he just, because I was clearly almost on the verge of an anxiety attack, he just walked around in the science building. He showed me, some labs that only the graduate students would see, and waited until I was at a calm enough place to kind of explain what was happening and check in with me. And I had never told him my diagnosis was an anxiety disorder, but he went out of his way to really make sure that this student who he, didn't really know, was still safe and was, comfortable, and that, I wasn't, like, it was okay that I wasn't going to go to class, but he still wanted to make sure I was okay. So even though there are some professors who maybe don't see it, there's other professors who really do understand what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. I actually had a similar experience when I briefly mentioned that professor wrote a letter recommendation for me. We actually had a talk on class about barriers that people with disabilities face, and like that was too much at the time for someone who was undiagnosed and like dealing with that. So I left the class and I sent her an email, and I'm like, I'm sorry, this was really hard for me. And she invited me for tea. I guess if like there's any professors or teachers watching and you're wondering how to best support your students if they seem very overwhelmed, whether it's due to a disability or a mental health issue, I think both of our experiences are like examples that we really do appreciate it. I'm seeing 2 questions by someone named Lori that are both more about self-advocating and also supporting a kid that are which I think are very important questions and related to each other. I don't know about you, but like when you go to college, it's like the first time that you really are on your own and have to like push for yourself. Um, I think it depends on the person. I think some kids would appreciate if they like had a strong advocate as a parent pushing for them, but some might not because they're not totally comfortable with that situation. I would say that you really have to be diligent, unfortunately, when it comes to getting the accommodations that you want. However, that could depend per school. So when I think if you're talking to a kid, it could be asking, how could I support you in this situation?
I definitely agree with that. I think one of the biggest things, at least for me and my parents, was, as we transitioned and like learned what my anxiety disorder really was learning to, ask me what I wanted for support. Because when, my mom thought she was helping, she, was giving all this advice, but I don't know what's happening either. And at the time, it's like, I don't want your advice. I want, to vent to you, or I want you to listen, or I want you to support, but not do it yourself. And like, you don't have to give an answer. But I think also for the advocates, I like advocating for, she pushed me to advocate for myself. She really did. At times, I didn't always like that, but it's what I needed. My anxiety would make me procrastinate doing certain things if it dealt with the social interaction. So as opposed to, ever doing it herself, she was very much like, no, you need to call them. And, if I came up with a problem and it was something as simple as, okay, I just need to actually call a person or go in and talk to someone, it was her kind of just gently telling me, you could probably get help with this problem if you went in and talked with your professor. And I didn't like that answer, but I knew it was the truth. And because someone was saying that and kind of backing that up, it helped me to self-advocate and it helped me to go do that. It was never like she was stepping on my toes to go in and do it herself. It was more of just like, look, it's okay to ask for help, and reaffirming that I can do that. Because I think, at least again, from my side of anxiety, you don't feel like you can do that. I felt like I just was kind of shut away, and I was like, I shouldn't do anything. So yeah, but I agree. I think it definitely depends on the person. And I think don't be afraid to talk to someone and ask, what they want. Because even if they don't know, they can say that to you, as opposed to assuming what someone would want. Ask them how you can support them.
Yeah, for sure. I want to go back to something that you brought up earlier, is about notes themselves, because I've heard a lot from the mental health, chronic illness, and disability community that people are very split on bringing notes to disability services in order to get accommodations. One thing that I would like to say is that the disability services offices aren't allowed to tell you your disability, health condition, or chronic illness to a professor unless you give them your explicit permission. So if that's a concern, whether or not you want to contact disability services because you don't want professors or maybe other classmates to know that you're dealing with a health condition or disability, that's something you should know.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important. And again, as you said, unless you're bringing it up to the professor, there's no way that they're going to know it.
Mhm.
Which I think the other thing for me, at least going into college, again, even though I had accommodations beforehand, they don't tell you when you go to college how to go get accommodations. Nobody kind of hands you a packet and says, here are the steps. It's not really in your intro packet or anything. So I think for someone, I guess for you, I would ask, how did you, I mean, I know you had a friend who had accommodations, but how did you go about learning to figure that out? Because that seems like a difficult process to just out of nowhere have to go get these accommodations alone, not knowing what you're doing.
Well, I think two very different experiences. So during my first semester at my first school, I was in the hospital for about a week and I was like very sick. And then like getting out was like, I don't know what to do. I'm in literally in the middle of midterms. So I did go asking for accommodations. I wasn't able to get any long-term accommodations at the time, which I really needed. But the people in the office did help me talk to my professors in order to get extensions the second time around. I finally had a diagnosis on paper, a letter from my doctor. So before I even got to the school, I emailed the disability services office. I'm like, hey, can I set up a phone call to talk to them to see what essentially accommodations that I could get?
Do you think from your experiences or friends' experiences, do you think in general that the disability services seem to be pretty accessible, or that there's some things that kind of make it inaccessible?
I think there are very different things. I think one of the biggest things which stopped a lot of people, but I guess it didn't stop me. It can be hard like realizing that you need help at time, and so that could be something. For example, like in my situation, I didn't have any symptoms of an autoimmune disease before I was in my first semester of college. Someone might also realize a really bad increase in their anxiety, like during their midterms or something during their first semester. It's like, well, I need accommodations. I don't know how to do this. Or maybe you're from a family or a culture where there's some shame, I guess, in asking for help. I guess those could be barriers as well.
Yeah, definitely from a couple friends that I have who, are even in the mental health world with me and everything. Some have said that their schools are great. Some schools it's very easy to go about the process. I think it depends on the school you're in as well. And then I know other people who have just given up on the process because depending on where you are, I had one friend tell me that every time they went in, it was just different paperwork. It was different expectations for what they needed to do to even get the accommodations. And that becomes a barrier for, especially if someone's doing it, without support, or it is their first time, or, they're not entirely understanding or accepting of what's happening with them. That becomes a really big barrier, as opposed to kind of being supported through the process and open to the process. If the school is kind of, well, fill out this paperwork and not really supporting you through it, I think it becomes a barrier for getting those accommodations that you do need. And even though, I didn't experience that in college, in high school, that was a big barrier for me. I was just diagnosed, and when I went to get accommodations, they said, okay, even though you've been working your butt off to try to stay in as an average student, we don't want to support you because you're doing well enough. And it was like, that doesn't mean I don't need accommodations. That doesn't mean I'm not struggling. I'm just trying to not struggle, and I'm trying to ask for support so I can do better. So I think it's unfortunate that I've heard a lot of friends' stories and a lot of stories in general of people kind of giving up on those accommodations before they can even get to them. Maybe because of fear of, what's happening. As you said, if it's your first time and you don't know what you're going through, or you've never been diagnosed with anything before, it's really hard to accept that even to begin with. And then to say, I need help and I need accommodations, it's very stigmatizing at first. So, once you've accepted that, and once I think you get the accommodations, it's incredibly helpful for getting through college. I know someone in the comments also mentioned that, is that, once they had the accommodations, school became a lot less of a struggle and they were able to get their bachelor's degree, which is, I completely agree. I don't think I would have gotten through school without my accommodations. I also think I still probably needed some different ones, and I didn't know quite how to advocate at the time. But without those, I definitely wouldn't have been able to at all.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in my situation, while my second school was a lot better, I did have a bad concussion last fall, and I was first asking for accommodations, and they basically told me it was impossible. But then COVID-19 happened. So essentially, I was wanting to know whether or not it would be possible to have a more flexible attendance policy, and I guess maybe more understanding in the amount of work that I would or would not be able to do, which is also interesting in general because I feel like COVID-19 has really transformed both disability services, what's being offered, and also universities in general.
Do you think that's for you, it sounds like in a positive way in general? You were able to get those accommodations more because of COVID-19?
Yeah, I did, which I know personally it's a privilege that like I was able to be in a place where like I have access to Wi-Fi. I have my own computer, which I realize not everyone has. So essentially, I was able to do that, and also just with how my university responded to COVID-19, and that they really limited the amount of coursework that we had to do to
Oh.
complete the semester, and they also changed it to an A minus scale. So basically, you got an A or A minus, and those were the only two grades, which I did not ask for when I was originally asking for accommodation after my head injury. So that was definitely interesting as well. But I did feel like I did get a lot more accommodations that I had asked for, and just like more flexibility. Just think it's interesting because I think COVID-19 is showing that a lot of flexibility people want is possible
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah, I think as you said, like everything basically kind of had to transition to virtual because of COVID-19. And when I was in college at the time, I think almost every single one of my exams was in class, except for one professor who, because I was an athlete during college, every so often I would miss an exam because I would be away at a game, and so I'd have to take it beforehand. And she actually allowed me to take it on a computer through, a setup in a system, so that I could take it kind of wherever I needed to and like take the exam at the time I needed, and I had the extended time. And for me, that was fantastic because I was like, cool, I can do this. I'm not pressured with the time. I have my extended time. So I liked being able to do virtual, but that was the first time I'd ever experienced it. So having those all moved online definitely, I think, switches around a lot of the accommodations. I think the other thing for me is, there's definitely some drawbacks as well. I was very time sensitive. That's part of the reason I had the extended time, is because I would really focus only on how much time I had left for exams. So if there's a clock in front of me, I will only look at the clock, and I will not work on whatever the exam is in front of me, because I'm just sitting there going, I only have 59 minutes left. I only have 58 minutes left. And so the problem with the online was that there was a bar up in the corner that told me how much time I had left. And that became a huge kind of trigger for my anxiety, because though I was, thankful to be taking it on a computer in, format that I preferred for my dyslexia and everything, I was also staring at this giant clock in front of me. Whereas in a testing room, I could have the clock behind me. So I didn't have to worry about the time. So I think, with the transition to COVID, there's definitely drawbacks and benefits, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how schools over time move forward with accommodations. And, I'm glad that they're having more flexibility right now, but I hope that continues. Mm-hmm. And I hope that's, for everyone. I know, one of my friend's schools, they reached out to them as, a few weeks into COVID because their disability services was really good. But I feel like some other schools, it might be like these students are getting left behind if, they do have different types of accommodations that maybe aren't as, aren't set up for, a virtual space. For some computer notes, I have horrible handwriting and I'm dyslexic. Taking notes is horrible. So I loved being able to type on a computer, but for others, maybe that's not the case. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you have any experience in those or have heard any stories in those, but I think there definitely are some inaccessible parts of COVID as well for this.
Yeah, I personally had a pretty good experience. Also, if anyone has any questions about online learning or something similar related to COVID stuff, if you write in the comments, we would be happy to respond to that. I think I had a good experience. I had a few of my professors decided to have meetings on Zoom at the start of when we went online. A few of them stopped after the first few, just because whether some people just couldn't make it or were dealing with a lot of stuff in their lives. But personally, for me, I read lips. So if someone's like screen is off and their camera's off and I only hear the audio, then it's a bit of a struggle to put together what everyone's saying. And of course, I want to hear what everyone is saying. I was given the option actually to like get written notes, but I didn't follow through on that for whatever reason. I can't remember. But I just like wanted to be able to participate and pay attention in the moment, but that just like made it so much harder personally.
And that's probably going to be a barrier for if you return to physical classes for wearing masks and everything too. If that becomes a standard in classrooms, I would guess.
Yeah, for sure. I'm actually going to be returning as like a teaching assistant in the fall. So
oh my gosh,
be something I personally experienced. So I completely support and want everyone to wear masks while we're in the middle of this current situation. I think it's a barrier that not a lot of people think about, I guess. Well, it's not like, I don't think necessarily something schools or universities doing, but also that a lot of people, when they make masks, they don't think about making it clear. So there are people who have like made them or selling them on Etsy. That's really not an accessibility thing across the board, but I don't think that's like up to universities per se to fix.
Yeah, I think the other thing for virtual, I know some schools have already moved classes to virtual, is the fact that some people aren't in homes where they, have a space where they can work and are alone. Or, especially for testing, for my accommodation was to be in a separate testing location. If someone needs it really quiet in order to test well, but they're in a space where, they maybe have a lot of siblings or a lot of family, they can't work to their best ability because they don't have that space set aside and they don't have that. It's just not, something they have with them. So it's another barrier for being virtual that is just, how do you approach that? What do you do for, can you now talk, even though you're not diagnosed with someone, are you able to talk to someone about getting accommodations or, figuring out how to do exams or tests when you're in a space in a home environment that doesn't allow you to move forward with your education well? And again, anyone, you're welcome to put stuff in the comments. We love talking to you guys from the comments. So
yeah, for sure. It's definitely complicated. I think just in like pre-COVID times, like dealing with this on your own can feel like very isolating and like you're the only one dealing with it. You're not. So I'm sure if you talk to friends or maybe even join or even lurk on your school's Reddit, you're going to hear about experiences that people have had with their disability services, whether or not you want to reveal yourself or use an anonymous forum. And I really think like talking to people can help getting accommodations in general feel less isolating, because it really can be a process, especially when it feels like people aren't listening to you.
Yeah, I definitely, it's, works for both ways. I have always been very open about talking about my accommodations or talking about my mental health. Part of that because, especially in high school, no one else would. I wanted to talk to someone else. I wanted to find other people who were going through this. And like the first time I entered a testing accommodations room, I knew the majority of the people there, but no one would look at each other. No one would talk to each other. There was such a stigma around it. I was like, why won't we talk? Why didn't I know you guys had accommodations? Like, why are we hiding this? And, so by college, I was very used to talking about it. And, I spoke very easily about it. When I went abroad for a semester, I had to get the accommodations in the school that I was attending abroad. And I remember I had like a little group of friends that I had kind of found, and we were on our way to lunch, and I kind of broke away and I was like, oh, sorry, I'll meet you guys there. I actually have to go to the accommodations office and, turn my accommodations letter and talk with them. And one of the girls pulled me aside and she was like whispering to me, and she was like, what are you talking about? What accommodations? What do you mean? And, for me, I was happy to speak about it, but she almost couldn't believe I was saying any of that out loud. Mm-hmm. It was not something you spoke about out loud. And afterwards, after I was like, you can ask me any questions. It's completely fine. Like, I'm happy to talk about it. A couple of weeks later, she ended up getting, pulling me aside again and, asking more about my anxiety disorder. And later on, went and got help with anxiety, and was able to get through her own accommodations. So I think being open, if you are someone who is open and talking, that's not an easy thing to do. I'm definitely not saying that, but if you are someone who is, willing or wants to talk about it, don't be afraid to talk about it. A lot more people are accepting of it than you realize. And want to learn about it or want to talk about it, and it's educating someone else if you're not afraid to talk about it in that sense. And then you also will probably find a lot of people who also have accommodations, and you just don't know that. That's how I found a couple of my friends. But yeah, I think it's definitely depends on the people you talk to. Not everyone always has the best views, but definitely you're not alone in going through it. There's a lot more people who are in a similar boat.
Yeah, for sure. And even if they're not in a similar boat, I found that sometimes where I've struggled to get accommodations, or that I've actually gotten help from classmates who have seen me struggling. Like, for example, at my first school, I am hard of hearing. I was supposed to get a note taker in one of my classes. Didn't happen. So in Montreal at the time, or always in Montreal, if you know the area, there's so much construction. So I was in a foreign language class, and we were supposed to write down what we hear. And this wasn't a test. This was just a class exercise. And I was really struggling. One of my classmates saw that I was struggling, and he pulled me aside and was like, "Hey, I can send you the notes if you want. I can see that that was hard for you. And also there's so much noise in the background," and things like that really help. I think for the most part, your classmates do want to help you, but I understand that might not be the case across the board, and everyone's experience is definitely different.
For sure. I think for me, I was, again, I at one point, I think I was offered to have notes written for me. But I didn't want to take it up because I felt like, that was burdensome to someone else. And for whatever reason at the time, I probably should have. But because, as I said, I'm dyslexic, and the writing of notes, when I have to write really quickly, I end up not being able to read my notes. If I have to handwrite notes, I can't read any of them. So I would have certain classes that would require you take only handwritten notes. They didn't want laptops to be used, and that was a huge barrier for me. So later on in school, if there was a class like that, I would go up and talk to the professor afterwards and be like, "Hey, I want to explain why I really want to use a computer for notes." And most were understanding, but I also had classmates who would kind of either, be near me or next to me, or, if I was open and talking with that and I kind of befriended them, they would go over the notes with me. So they'd either, help provide notes, or if I was missing parts of my notes because, it was too fast for me to write legibly, they were completely willing to share their notes with me. And it was a good study tool as well, because then, okay, you have two different versions of notes. Let's go through them together and study and figure out, what happened during this class. So I think, as you said, it's not across the board, but there are a lot of students who, are understanding. And it's that part, though, of sometimes you do need to be a little bit more open if you want to kind of build those bridges. When I was especially closed off and, wasn't going to talk to anyone, people weren't going to help me with notes or anything like that.
Well, I guess people aren't going to deal with this much now, but because we're pretty much all using computers, but that just reminded me of COVID times. I have been in those classrooms too, where everyone's no computers allowed. And I've been uncomfortable at times to ask you the computer, because it kind of outs you as having, an illness or another condition where you might need it. And I think with the amount of undiagnosed people in university, it's a huge barrier to access as well. I understand there are studies which show that it might be helpful for some people to take notes, but it also can be a huge barrier to a lot of people as well. So I think that's a rule in classrooms that can actually be harmful to a lot of students.
Yeah, I think it was unfortunate to see how many professors were so against that. And as you said, often they would start their lectures the first, week or two with the studies showing why you need to be taking handwritten notes and why you can't use a computer. And then you have those of us who really can't use handwritten notes, sitting there going, okay, but I really want to ask to be able to use a computer. And as you said, it kind of outs you if you're not comfortable with that, which provides a lot of barriers towards your education. If you can't, if you're never getting notes for this class because you can't understand them in the format that a professor is having you take them, that's not worth it for you to be there in that class. You're not learning anything. So I'm hoping moving forward that, professors can slowly learn to maybe be more understanding of that. As you said, that's, a pre-COVID thing. But going back to physical classrooms, because everything was online, because, we had to be so flexible during COVID, I'm hoping that maybe moving forward, when it comes back to like physical classroom settings, professors will be a little bit more flexible with things like accommodations and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's not even, I guess, like a process of moving back to physical classrooms, as I guess. I feel like the past few months, a lot of my professors were very understanding, like, hey, if you can't get something in, it's fine. We understand we're in a pandemic. But a lot of people with chronic illnesses, they're dealing with health issues on sometimes a daily basis. And while, of course, chronic illness is different than COVID, our like daily experiences in college could be just as much of a barrier itself.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah,
hoping.
I think. No, go ahead. I was just gonna say, like, I think that it's been interesting to see as COVID's kind of happened and like arrived, how many more people have become aware of, what it's like to have a chronic illness or what it's like to struggle with your mental health, just in general. Because suddenly, people who maybe have never experienced anxiety in their lives are now having a ton of it from this transition from, being afraid of COVID or, the environment that they're now in at home, trying to do classes, whatever it may be. So many people are now starting to struggle with those areas, or again, starting to realize, like, I've heard more people have more awareness now. And again, this is not across the board, but around chronic illnesses and, that being difficult and people being more flexible with that. But why did it take COVID to make that noticed? And I'm glad that it is. And again, moving forward, I hope that continues. But it's been fascinating for me to have people reach out who, never struggled before and be like, well, how do you deal with this? How have you, always coped with this? I'm like, why did it take now for you to get to a point to, want to understand? Like, it's good that you are, and I'm glad things are more flexible. So I just think COVID had some interesting impacts for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just thinking back about like the people who are like me in situations where they were like undiagnosed with chronic illnesses,
Yeah.
struggling. In the future, our disability services can be so adamant, like, what do you have? Why do you need, like, kind of like demanding you need evidence for this? When I guess during this period where I guess like so many people are getting sick and having like this life interruptions, that's being understood. Are we now going to put the same understanding going forward to like anyone who needs accommodations, or are we going to regress back to what used to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's also going to be, are there more people who are going to reach out for accommodations?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you said, some places don't have a very big staff of disability services. Again, Cornell is a huge college and we had a pretty small staff for disabilities as well, which is why I think it felt kind of, I felt very separated from it. As someone, who had accommodations, they never really checked in with me. They never sat down and talked with me about what accommodations were available. It was more just like, here, get your letters, go.
Mm-hmm.
And, if I had stuck up for myself, sure, maybe that would have changed. But if you're just learning how to deal with this, how are you supposed to know to do that? And also now, if we have an influx of people that are, going to be asking for accommodations, I hope they're more flexible. But also, does that mean, we need more staff? We need more people who are in the disability services.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's a big thing as well. This should have happened before COVID, but after, I hope so too, that schools really need to do a better job at supporting their students. A lot of us or other people are dealing with issues that people don't really see, and it can be very hard to navigate, like going through your first time living without your family for some people, maybe even living in a new country and really feeling that you have no safety net. This doesn't really specifically have to do with disability services, but it has to do with trying to navigate college in general, and there are people who really do need those services. Schools and universities can and should do better. And I think that some changes that have happened during COVID have proven that they're really able to do so.
That there is a lot more flexibility. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, again, for some, I know virtual has been more convenient because, okay, maybe they don't have to travel. Maybe they don't have to, go into a location that makes them uncomfortable, or maybe driving is an anxiety trigger, all of these reasons. For some people, it's really nice to be able to do a virtual, meeting and doing, maybe meeting a therapist virtually. And then even at my university, when I was struggling in school and asked, I think it was like the end of my freshman year, I asked to start seeing therapists again because I was really struggling when it came to exams time. It took a couple months before they would even kind of get me in to see someone, and that someone, I don't know the exact, qualifications or anything like that, but she wasn't like a full therapist. She was more just like someone who was partially trained, and like a supporter. So you could go in, you could talk to her, but she couldn't really do anything for you. It was like a lower level person. And I appreciated that, but the fact that I had to wait so long to try to get help was a huge barrier. I mean, if I had been in a really bad place, that could have been a horrible outcome. So I hope now that, people can see, okay, even if, maybe you can't come in physically or you can't get to there, like maybe they'll be able to start offering things in a virtual. Do you want to Zoom a person? Do you want to do a Zoom therapy session to see how it goes, or to set something up, as opposed to having an appointment in person, and be more flexible with those in order to get the accommodations.
This is more rhetorical because I don't have an answer to myself, but I'm just really wondering how disability services, mental health services, and like in general, it's going to work going forward when a lot of schools seem to be adopting a hybrid model. So, like, would the people who go to class physically get priority, or will everyone be prioritized? Because I'm also wondering if like a hybrid model we can see actually does well. Would schools actually be willing to embrace that in the future? Because there are people, I personally like going to class, so, and interacting with people, so I prefer to go to in-person classes. But for people who don't, who might have a chronic illness, which might make them hard to leave the house, or maybe they have childcare as well, will they still get the same level of attention, or will they be like, oh, you're our second priority because you're not actually going to classes itself?
Yeah, I think that's a really realistic concern. And as you said, kind of rhetorical because we don't know, but it's a big concern in that fact of, if you can't go in person, are you still going to be getting, first of all, the same level of education as well? Are they going to do different types of lectures in person than the ones online? I would hope not, in the sense, like, as you said, hybrid can be really good for some people. If you're having, maybe a really, really rough day and you don't, want to go to class, if you maybe now have the opportunity to be like, okay, well, can I take this lecture online today? That means you could, be comfortable if you maybe have a chronic illness, or as comfortable as possible, while still trying to, get the education and see your lecture or attend class, as opposed to beforehand where you either were struggling through that, or, having to miss class and then falling behind. So I'm also very interested to see how that will play out. I think if universities and disability services and everything works together in a good way moving forward, a hybrid model could really work. It's just whether they do end up trying to give priority to certain students or not.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think there's any way that you think the pandemic could actually improve on disability services?
I think, yeah, I feel like I've kind of mentioned a couple of them in a sense, but like if potentially, and this all, as you said, kind of earlier on in the stream, depends on if you have access to computer, if you have access to Wi-Fi and data plans. So that itself is a barrier. But if we're talking about, ways it could improve, if you do have access to all those things, I think someone with a chronic illness or mental health disorder, it can be really helpful if potentially, for me, I definitely had extreme days for my anxiety disorder. I had a lot of stomach problems from it, which kept me almost bedridden sometimes. I couldn't eat anything. It's not because I didn't want to eat. I physically could not eat. And so I had many days where I'd end up going to class and I'd almost run out and like faint in the hallway because I was just so physically unable to function at that point. And so if I had been able to say, hey, you know what, I need to kind of like rest a little bit more, I'm going to take this lecture in my home. And maybe I had either a certain, I don't know how they would split that up for accommodations, but it's like, okay, maybe you have a certain amount of days you can do lectures from home. Maybe you can work a more hybrid schedule and have a choice to do a hybrid, not just, oh, I physically can't go to school, so I'm only allowed to do online. But if I have a choice to either go to classes, do virtual, or do a hybrid, and I know that hybrid might, be more consistent for me to be healthier, and I can choose that could be really beneficial. And then also for if maybe having access to either therapists or checking in with disabilities virtually, as opposed to having to go physically, that could be something that just helps improve what you maybe could get for disability services. Because again, pre-COVID, you have to go in and talk to them and set up an appointment. It might be easier now to have more appointment times, and just do a quick, virtual meeting as opposed to kind of going in, waiting in a waiting room, getting the appointment and leaving, which you have to schedule into your already really busy class schedule.
There's one thing that I just thought of that I really am hoping that the pandemic kind of showed that we shouldn't have our attendance policies. I can't remember. I was at McGill University for my first school. So like I remember in one of my classes, they're like, you have 2 absences, then you fail the class. So it's like, and I was also undiagnosed at the time, so I didn't register with disability offices to have flexible attendance. I don't know on the top of my head if they excused it based on that, but that's just a stressful thing. Like if you're dealing with health issues or a mental health condition, it's like, it's not really an accessible thing to like force people to physically go to class when they're probably going to pay for it later. So yeah, I'm really hoping that gets left behind. At the new school, they had a similar thing where I think it was 4 classes, and even if you were on disability services, registered with disability services, it was still up to the professor of whether or not your absences could be excused. Fortunately, mine were accommodating. I don't know of situations of professors who were not accommodating, so I can't speak to everyone's experience at my school. But even that is just a stressful thing.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe that. Sorry, that's a lot to take in as far as even it's still up to the professor. Because I definitely had some professors that, as I said before, you would go hand in the letter and they'd give you a kind of, or like be judging you for having your accommodations. And I remember having to fight with a few of them and be like, no, you need to give me the extended time. And if I want, I had the option to take it in a separate location. And so because it was the option, they're like, well, you're going to take it here. And I was like, no, I'm not. I don't have to. And them kind of being like, well, you can take it here, so just take it here. And it's like, why are you fighting me on this? Well, I'm already, at a place where I'm too anxious to be, facing this and dealing with this. And now you're arguing with me about it. And so it took a lot to kind of stand up for myself to even get the accommodations that I had. So the attendance policy is something I hadn't really thought about before, but you're right. There was definitely times where for me, it was incredibly unhealthy for me to be going to class at the state I was in. But because we had an attendance policy, my anxiety does not allow me to kind of break that. So, I would never take a sick day, no matter how sick I was, no matter how I was feeling, because I felt like, okay, like what if I'm going to need this later on? I only have 1 sick day. Like I only have 1 day that you can't be in class, and I'm an athlete. And some of the professors were really, it was supposed to be for athletics that, if you had to leave for your athletics, that would kind of be okay. I had a lot of professors who went against that and basically like well, if you miss this, that counts as your days out of class. And I was like, I'm traveling all the time during the semester. So you're telling me that I can only take those days for my sport and never for my actual health. So I agree. I think it would be really important to have, to kind of get rid of the attendance policy. Because it's kind of on the student to, you know, if it's healthier for me to be out of class and I know I'll be able to get my work done and I know I'll be able to keep up, then why is it so bad for me to miss one class? If I'm able to make that up, if I'm able to still get the notes, go to, you know, get the lecture and do well, I should be allowed to take care of my health. But I don't know what they're going to do about that. You're right. That would be really nice if moving forward, if they were able to do that though.
Yeah, for sure. And with the new school, fortunately, my professors were more understanding. And even my doctor would just send notes through the portal, but they were like, you need to send a doctor's note every time you're sick. And I'm like, I am chronically sick. So, and I don't want to go across New York City to see my doctor. Fortunately, she would just send me notes herself without making me do it. But like, I'm sure there are other students who like their doctors would be like, okay, you have to come in. And some days if you're really sick, like traveling on a subway will make you feel more sick. And so,
yeah,
yeah,
for sure. I mean, I know even for my doctors and everything like that, it's, you still had to go into an appointment and there's not always appointments available. Mm-hmm. So how, when you want to take that day off, do you get an appointment to get a note to get the day off? To not be in class? That's not accessible. That doesn't do anything. And as you said, for someone who's undiagnosed, they might, you know, they wouldn't even potentially have the opportunity to be like, well, I'm diagnosed with this here, you know, can you send a doctor's note? They don't know what's going on. So they would have to make an appointment and go and not get that time. But you're right. Yeah. Subways also do not help with the traveling thing.
Yeah. And that's something I'm just hoping schools, I guess, leave behind post-COVID. It's like making, I guess, students prove that like they need stuff, I guess, because as a society, we recognize that people have a lot of things out of their control.
Yeah, I think as well, like I'm hoping more professors become understanding. It seems like you've had a lot of good interactions with professors, but in general, I hope that, you know, professors who maybe weren't as understanding can see and be more flexible because of COVID and everything that's brought up, and, you know, shown that there can be flexibility and students can still do work. So now maybe they can be more flexible with things and understanding. I probably had a split of, you know, I had some instances with a couple of professors that were really, really good, and they were very understanding, but it was usually only if I had proved throughout that year that I was, you know, a reliable student, that, you know, if I had missed something or, you know, and this was the one time I, you know, was coming to get help, or I was, you know, I was asking for an extension or something like that. It was only if it was like the end of the time I had been with that professor, because they knew, looking at my grades and looking at, you know, my attendance, that I had been a good student. If you're in the beginning or, you know, say the first round of your midterms or finals or whatever it may be for your school, and they don't trust you yet, they probably wouldn't have given me, you know, the same extensions or anything like that for some of these professors. And so I'm hoping the pandemic can make maybe some professors a little bit more understanding. In another way, it's probably also easier for some students. Like I said, for me, it was always really difficult to go to professors with my accommodations beforehand. Whereas if you are virtual and online, you could potentially send that to them online. You can potentially, you know, talk to them alone online, or that kind of sense, and not have to do it in front of your entire group of students.
So yeah, we have 5 minutes left. If anyone has any last minute questions you want to answer, just drop them in the comments.
And definitely look at the links in the comments. Julia wrote some fantastic articles beforehand about disability services. You should definitely check those out. Keep them, just take the link, store it somewhere. But yeah, I think even if you're not also like a student, even as a parent, you know, it's important to kind of know this and know these kind of experiences, because if your child is going through this alone, you know, you still can say, hey, accommodations are possible. Like if you know, even if they're not diagnosed with someone, you can potentially talk to them about the fact that there is accommodations. You don't need to be, you know, embarrassed about asking for help or getting those accommodations. They can be incredibly helpful through your experience for college. And if there's anything I probably learned from like all of my time in school and everything like that, is don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. Don't be afraid to go in and really ask questions about things. What they tell you might not be all that's there. So, you know, if you think you want more, if you really want to understand things more, always feel free to ask questions, advocate for yourself. If you don't think what they give you is fair, go talk to them. Like, that's probably the biggest lesson I've learned.
Mm-hmm. And just going off of advocating for oneself, I think one thing that really helped me do that is reminding myself that I deserve to get the access I need to get a good education services, especially if you're living in the United States. You may be paying a lot of money for it, or your parents might be. So I should try and get the help that I need for sure. And I think also another thing that very important is just to, I guess, really, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, is to really, I guess, educate yourself on like possible accommodations that you could get. Like I mentioned at the start of the stream, is that like I knew that my friend who had type 1 diabetes is that she had stop time. And so I'm like, okay, I'm getting ready to advocate myself. I'm trying to get myself as prepared as possible. If it helps, if it's not virtual, or if it is virtual, just like having a piece of paper with you, making sure like, hey, I want to talk about XYZ when I'm talking to disability services, that could be helpful as well.
I think that's huge. Yeah. Looking, look up beforehand. I'm sure you can find Reddit articles, if not just regular articles on what can be offered. Again, for me at first, I didn't know any of those. I know, some friends who that the school has been incredibly good with their disability services, and they went down the list like one by one and were like, would this be helpful for you? Why are we not? And they kind of were like, no, I really think you should take this one up. Just have it there in case. And we're even kind of like allowing the student to have that, being like, we think this would be a good option for you. Even if you don't think you want to use it right now, we're going to put it in there so that later on, if you do want to use it. So it's not to say that every, university or college is bad with their disability services. But I also agree. I think the more you know about the potential accommodations you could have, or even ones that you think maybe don't apply to you when you've just heard the term, don't be afraid to kind of ask about it and bring those up and say, hey, what else is there? And don't be afraid to go in once you've had your accommodations. Those can change. Those don't have to stay the same. If you need to change your accommodations, if you feel like you need more, or there's something different that you want to try, go in and talk to them and, actually be proactive in trying to change that, because your mental health, your, chronic illness, you can have flare-ups, you can change, like a lot of things can change in your life, especially over the time when you're in college. So I think just don't be afraid, even if you have gotten your accommodations, to change them as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's, I guess, a note to end on is that there's no shame in asking for help. It could definitely be hard. I mean, we've both talked about how our accommodations helped us a lot. There's some people in the comment section who, I forget who said it earlier, like she was able to finish her degree because of her accommodations as well.
Yeah. I think it's probably the biggest thing in general, even outside of school, that I've learned from my mental health is advocating for yourself, but also that you don't need to be ashamed. Mm-hmm. The more that I spoke about it out loud, the more that I realized there were people around me who either were experiencing similar things, wanted to learn more about it, or were accepting about it. Sure, you might run into people who aren't always, but there's a lot of people around you who are probably in a similar place as you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's any last minute questions, we can look in the comments, but
happy to answer.
Thank you, Pete. But it's always interesting to hear someone else's. Like, thank you for doing this with me today, Julia, because it's always interesting to hear someone else's experience in this kind of one like specific thing.
Yeah, thank you for chatting with me. I guess also on that is like everyone has a totally different experience with disability services, mostly because everyone has different accommodations. You go to different schools. You might be treated a different way due to if you're a part of a minority group, any reason. But basically, we hope that this conversation answered some of your questions, and if not, we hope that it was informative.
Yeah, and again, there's links in the description you can go find. I'm sure you can find me at my page. I'm Eldredge Anxiety. You can always ask questions there. Or keep writing questions in the comments. There's, people who can help answer. I usually go through them afterwards and answer comments if there's any questions that are unanswered. So thank you for everyone who tuned in, for those of you that did ask questions. Yeah.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.